So hopefully everyone got a chance to create a bare bones React native React project. If you haven't, it's just a one-line thing, npx create React app. And it just takes less than a minute for that to set up, usually, depending on your connection speed. So we're going to be starting totally from scratch, just from the bare bones created project. So let me share my screen. Great. Can everyone see my?
Yep.
Great. So React, what's the big deal? And this, like I said, this is, this started off as when React was a new thing, and now it's about why is React a big deal in such an established way. So first, I'm just going to chat a little bit about React, and we'll dive into the code shortly after that. So basically, big question is, what is React, first of all? And really all React is it's a JavaScript library for creating views. And there's not really much more to it than that. It is obviously very complicated. If you look closely when you first generate your standard bare bones React project, there's tens of thousands of files in there. So it seems massive and, complex, and it is under the hood. But for you, the developer, this is really just a tool for making views. You can put other logic in there if you want, and certainly you will. But a lot of that stuff is not really React specific. What React specifically does is handles your views, handles the interactions between your users and the code that you've written. But what makes it special, and you'll notice there's an asterisk there because special doesn't necessarily mean unique. It is just kind of what helped React take off. A lot of the stuff that makes React special has now been kind of borrowed and iterated on by some of the other frameworks out there, like Vue.js or Angular and stuff like that. They've all gotten a lot more similar since React got popular, partly as a response to it. But it does still make React special, I think. The things that I've identified, this is kind of me subjectively, but I think are important to note about React are components, JSX, the diffing algorithm, and the ecosystem, the whole community of React developers. Components are essentially the basic building block of any React app. The React app itself is a component, and it allows you to break up your UI into small pieces, basically. And ideally, you let them all kind of focus on one thing or on a small subset of things that are easy to understand and are kind of self-contained. You don't have to do it that way. React, as we're going to get into, doesn't really make a lot of assumptions about how you're going to build your app. It's not opinionated. By the way, if you hear some children in the background, just feel free to ignore them. There's going to be a little bit of that. The cool thing though is that, like I said, the whole app is a component. So all of your components are nested kind of by default. And through that, you can build out this pretty complex, app architecture if you want, that still allows everything to sort of have a singular role and be easy to understand and kind of debug and figure out on its own. But it's ultimately up to you to do this. Just React gives you a lot of good tools to make that possible. JSX. JSX is what I like to call a Frankenstein's monster of HTML and JavaScript, but a good monster. It is just a particular kind of syntax. We're going to be using it right off the bat. It looks a lot like HTML with a little bit of JavaScript sprinkled in, essentially. It kind of follows its own rules. So you're not doing pure if you've ever done any basic web design, you might have messed around a little bit with just basic HTML. It's not that different. It adds a little bit of extra kind of spice to allow you to put more dynamic behavior into that markup without getting too complex. And it's pretty well designed. It's one of my favorite things about React. JSX is actually optional. Here, this is these two columns here. You will see JSX on the left and then some pure JavaScript code on the right. That is basically what React turns that JSX into. When React first launched, very, very beginning, you didn't have JSX and you actually had to write React kind of like that, like on the right. I have no idea if that's even still valid React code, but it doesn't matter because you will probably never, ever write anything like that. As you can see, it's pretty complex, chain together a lot of JavaScript stuff. The whole point of JSX is to abstract that away. So you don't have to worry about exactly what you're telling React to do on a code level. It kind of just takes care of it for you. The diffing algorithm, this might sound a little scary, but the good news is, much like JSX, like you don't have to worry about this. This is a thing React is doing on its own, and hopefully you'll never think about it at all. Essentially what it is it's taking a look at your data that's feeding into your views, your components that you built. It waits for changes to that data, and as soon as those changes are made, it will automatically update your UI for you, and you don't have to think about it at all. And that actually right there, probably more than anything else about React, is why it got so incredibly popular. Because if you ever did any web development, any front-end web development, before 2015, before 2010 even, you would have had to deal a lot with dealing with dynamic data that's happening in your JavaScript somewhere, and data updating, and then having to update your views to reflect that. That might sound simple, but that is where 99% of all of your problems came from. Like pretty much all of the complexity of the app seemed to be in making sure that your views were properly up to date at the right time, that they were reflecting things correctly, and you weren't ending up in weird edge cases where something hadn't updated exactly as fast as you thought, or you didn't remember to update this one particular bit of code and you forgot about it. It was all on you, the developer, to remember that those connections had to happen and when that change had to be reflected to the user. React basically did away with that entirely, to the point where you hopefully shouldn't have to think at all about whether things have updated properly. They just do. And that is enormous. That has saved so much time and just so much mental effort on the part of developers everywhere. And I think that's why React got as popular as it did. And that's basically it. Like I said, the rest is up to you. Oh, I don't think I have an ecosystem thing in here. Okay, I mentioned the ecosystem. The ecosystem being just, React itself and everyone working on React. It's a Facebook project, but it's open source and has a lot of contributors, but also all of the third-party tools and libraries, the whole community and everything, the kind of support you get if you're having trouble and you need to ask questions online. Sample projects, sample code, tutorials. React has tons and tons of this because it's so popular. It's one of those things where the popularity of the framework kind of became self-sustaining, and it allowed people to get their foot in the door easier because there's so many resources out there to help if you're having any kind of trouble or you're trying to do any unusual sort of thing that might seem, like you're not going to be able to track down someone who's done it. Well, probably someone's done it. Probably someone has a package that will do that work for you, or maybe there are several competing packages. This is really great. Having that level of choice as a developer is massive. And as you get more into development as a career, definitely this has happened to me, you start more and more learning that you really should not be reinventing the wheel every time you have a problem. You want to try to reach out and see if there's a tool that's already built where someone has, done the legwork and solved the particular problem you're trying to solve. And a lot of times which tools we choose are heavily dependent on how many of those kind of third-party libraries and helpers are there out there. Sometimes you can be really excited about a new particular platform or framework, and it just doesn't have that level of support. So no matter how well designed the framework itself is, if you're trying to do something very specific that it wasn't really designed for, you're kind of on your own, and you can end up spending a lot of time doing that. So that's just something to keep in mind in the future. As these tools evolve, React will evolve. Probably something will come along that will start stealing React's thunder. When you're trying to choose what platform you go for, that's a really big part of your decision-making process. So the rest is up to you. I probably called React a framework a few times. I probably will again, because there's not really a great word for it. But it's not really a framework in the sense that it defines a structure for you. It's a set of tools that you can use basically however you want. Like I said, it's just the view layer. React really handles all that interaction between the user and your app, whatever your app is doing. What your app's doing behind the scenes, the real structure of it, maybe it's some kind of a, it could be some kind of social platform. It could be just a simple interface for, website that you want to just be, very easy for people to use. It could be a game even. All that stuff, all that logic is going to live outside of React itself, really. I mean, React will give you a place to put it, but that is just kind of up to you what you want that to be. So when you want to build out structure in your React app, you tend to use other tools that sit on top of React. Redux is one that you're probably going to hear a lot about if you start getting more into React. It's great. It's got its own peculiarities and it's definitely got a learning curve, but we use it on all of our apps. It's a really nice way to manage the data state of your app. But it's not React, and you can do React without it. You can also use Redux without React, although I don't think people do that very often. They tend to fit together really well. And then of course there's backend frameworks that might be Rails or Node or Django or something like that. Where all your data actually lives, where the real logic of your app lives most of the time is going to be in something like that. Because React is all running in the browser in real time. It is, JavaScript that your browser is executing. So the browser can, save stuff and has some capacity, but generally you have some kind of centralized backend where all your code lives. And React is really well designed to work with all of those. There are some of these backend frameworks have their own React kind of setup. Sometimes there's a third-party option for it. You can also basically just put React anywhere and just make API calls. You can talk to anything, any backend you want, essentially. So you have a lot of freedom in terms of what you do with your backend once you have a React app set up. You can also build your own structure. React does give you a lot of tools to do this. There's something called context, which I'm actually seeing less and less of these days. I don't know if it's just kind of on its way out or people just don't have much of a use for it, but context is a way you can pass down data. I mentioned before, these components that make up your app tend to be very nested. You might have one big app component and then a whole bunch of subcomponents that have their own, and it just kind of turns into this whole tree, right? That's pretty complicated. So if you want to pass down data from one part of that app to another, context lets you do that really easily without having to worry about all the little connections that make that branch, essentially. And there's also something called hooks, which can be used to create structure. They're also a way that you now connect to things like Redux. So they've kind of just become a new way of handling changes in state within your app. We're going to get a little bit into that over the course of this tutorial. And that's basically it. I think right now we can go ahead and just hop right into the sample code, but does anyone have any questions before we get started on that?
Would you recommend us to code along or kind of just pay attention to what you're doing?
Whatever works best for you. I am going to have you do stuff on your own at various points, just to try to see how you solve problems, because I think that's a really great way to learn personally. So yeah, I'd recommend you code along, but if you would rather just watch, I can't force you to do anything. So cool. So with that done, let's go ahead. So I have on my desktop, I just did npx create React app. Oops. And then, the name of my app, which in this case is Platoon Workshop. And that created this, let's take a quick tour of the file here. I created this big folder here. And within it, a bunch of stuff kind of comes right out the gate. You can actually rearrange a lot of the way this stuff works if you want, but generally you'll probably stick with this basic pattern. Something you're going to notice here is this, the tens of thousands of files that I mentioned that got created here are all pretty much contained within your node modules folder. I don't know if you've gotten into like how some of these, how Yarn or NPM work and how like package managers work at all. I don't know if that's something you've covered yet. But basically, all of the dependencies, all of those third-party tools that make React possible basically live in here. And in this case, your Yarn lock file, your package JSON file and this lock file here are how you keep track of all of those files and all the changes that get made to those over time. So you basically just want to kind of forget that this is here. It's very important that this folder is here because it makes all your stuff work, but you don't want to mess with anything within here. And generally, when you're using source control, you're not going to track any changes that happen within here, even though you can reach right into here and mess with all these files if you want. Nothing is stopping you. But generally, you want to be very thoughtful about the ways that you do that. So you're more worried about this stuff right here, specifically. You'll have a source folder that comes with a whole bunch of sample stuff. None of this is required for React right here. They're just kind of showing you how things work. And then your public folder is going to have some of your more like, you're probably gonna put images in here and stuff like that. Things that are not really code for the most part. So really, most of the action is going to be happening right here in this source folder. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. I'm using Visual Studio Code, but you can use any editor that you want. This one's just got some really nice extensions that make working with React pretty easy. So let's take a quick look here. So within a React project, since React is based on Node, and Node always has, Node projects are basically just like they're running on this JavaScript backend. And they always have this package.json, and this is sort of the source of truth for your whole app. This is kind of where everything gets defined, essentially. And this is where things like those dependencies that I mentioned are going to show up. Right now, this is quite small. As you build up a complicated app, this can get pretty large, especially your dependencies. We're not going to worry about any of this right now. We're not going to grab any third-party stuff. I want to just focus on React itself. But just so you know, this is a pretty important file, and it's something you'll be paying more attention to as you get into bigger apps. But in our case, there's an index.js file within source. And this is kind of the central, the sort of landing point of our code. This is where React first looks to determine what it's going to run as far as the app goes. So you notice at the top we have some imports here. We're pulling in some of this stuff we're pulling in directly from React itself and React DOM. These are things that just allow us to, run React in a browser essentially. And then below that, these are things we're importing from our own code. All that stuff works basically the same. You can, within a Node project, you can import files from other places nearby, however you want, pretty much. And that's generally how you're going to structure your app. Technically, you could just dump everything in one giant file if you wanted, but that would be a nightmare. So typically, we'll split up our different parts of our app into different files and just do things that way. And then here, finally, you have, this is where the actual app is being rendered. And right in here, you're going to see our first JSX. So this might look a lot like HTML if you're familiar with HTML. You got the angle brackets and everything, but these are not HTML components. These aren't, like, H1 tags or P tags or anything that you might be used to, but they're pretty similar. It's the same basic concept. You have open and closing tags rather, like this, and then anything that sits between those opening and closing tags is contained within that component. So it's very HTML-like. But these have been defined within React. You'll also notice they have capital letters as opposed to, like in HTML, usually you don't see that. That's a way that you can distinguish usually between something that's been created in React and something that's just a built-in HTML thing. So in this case right here, we have the thing that is important is this app tag right here. This is our app component. And if you open up app.js, this is what's actually in there. So the cool thing is once you've defined a component, and this can be as complex as you want, it can contain as many subcomponents as you want. Once you've defined that and you've just exported it, or if it's in the same file, this is just making the app available to other files so that it can be imported. But once you've defined it, all you have to do to drop it in somewhere is just this one single line of code takes all of this and reuses it. And you can do that as many times as you want. It's really powerful just how easily you can package things up and organize them. React actually makes that very, very easy for you, which is great because as your apps get complicated, you're going to have a lot of components and a lot of interactions between them. And being able to clearly visualize how they contain each other is one of the real strengths of JSX. So this is our proper app. So we don't really know what, before we get into this, let's take a look at what this is actually doing so we know what we're looking at. So let's go ahead. So I'm in the terminal right now and just in the root of the folder. And I'm going to go ahead and write yarn start. You can also do npm start. I don't know if you've talked at all about npm versus yarn, but essentially yarn is a tool that runs on top of npm and gives it some extra features that npm didn't used to have. npm has since added a lot of those features, so sometimes people will use one or the other, but they're basically interchangeable for this point. It's just a package manager that basically handles your dependencies, but also runs little scripts like this that will just start up React Native. What this is actually doing, if I go back to the package JSON, is it's running this. So You can create any script you want here and type yarn blank. In this case, we write yarn start. It's actually running this, but you don't need to worry about that. So if you go ahead and hit yarn start, hopefully this will work off the bat. Go ahead and it's going to open Chrome by itself. It'll probably open your browser automatically. If it doesn't, you can just go to localhost:3000 and you should see this. Everybody with me so far? Cool. That's React's first great opportunity to screw up or something. So this is not an unusual place for people to run into problems, actually.
You have yarn.lock in your.
What about it?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
You have yarn.lock. When I created a project here that wasn't automatically put in there, how do you get that?
That will happen when you run yarn. When it installs all of the packages. The lock file is essentially, if you open it up, you don't usually need to look at it. It's huge. This is just a record of all of the exact versions of all of the subdependencies that it installed. So you know exactly what it is. So when it's really a good thing for when you're sharing code with other people, because you don't always specify which version you're using. Like if here, so these actually do have some specifications, although they also have this little caret here. So like this could install React. I can't remember exactly what this does. I think this means that this will always install the latest version of React as long as it's 17 point something. But if there was a newer version available, I think it would bump up to 0.03 or 0.04 or something like that. Maybe someone else can correct me here. I always forget. There's a few little symbols like that. So essentially, if I have this code and I'm sharing this code with you and we both run yarn to install it, and we don't have a lock file, we might end up in a situation where I have installed 17.0.2 and you have installed 17.0.3, which may or may not make a difference, or it might totally break a bunch of stuff. So the lock file is just there essentially to say, like, even though sometimes you don't specify this at all, like the exact version, but the lock file knows exactly which version I had. So if we're sharing the lock file will try to stick to those versions exactly. So you and I are working on the exact versions of everything, which is why this is massive and totally unreadable.
So if you're using npm, then you get a package lock JSON file instead?
Yep. This is actually what npm didn't used to have. This is why yarn exists, because there was no lock file, so you didn't know exactly which versions other people were working with, unless you specified the exact version in your npm file. But you don't want to do that because these things update, and you do want to update your dependencies as they get improved and fixed and stuff like that. So yeah, were you able to get that lock file to appear?
What was the command? It was yarn.
Just yarn.
Okay. I don't know. It says yarn command not found when I run it. So
okay, you might need to install yarn then. I think you do. Do you install yarn? I think it's npm. I think it'd be npm i-g. You could also just use npm if you want, but
yeah, I don't want to hold you up. I'll just, yeah. I am already running it using npm as well. So
okay, that'll work. Yeah, you just install, it's an npm package, so you just install it globally. I just forget the exact command. I think it's npm i-g yarn, and that would work, but you can do that later, no big deal. Cool, so any other questions? Anyone else have any issues?
Quinn, this is backtracking a little bit, and I don't want to sidetrack too much if it's irrelevant, but when you had the app, the main app page up, there's something where it was wrapped around React strict mode. Is there anything that we know about strict mode, why that's important, or is that kind of just something?
Oh, this?
Yeah.
I don't know. Actually, this is new to me.
I know it impacts how you get to write your syntax you write. I think it's a little more stricter, hence strict mode. But I guess I just want to know if you have more clarity on it.
Yeah, I guess we'll see if it yells at us when we're doing this. I typically do all my app writing in TypeScript, which is kind of like its own. It's typed JavaScript, and I don't know if you work with any typed languages in Platoon actually, but it's a little bit, it's generally stricter across the board about what you do. You have to define more like specifically what kind of data you're using, and it will yell at you if it gets something it's not expecting. I expect strict mode might be something kind of like that, like a lightweight way where you can still use just plain JavaScript, but it will sort of warn you when things are going wrong. that's essentially what that strictness is all about. It's just trying to prevent you from making easily missed mistakes. Because JavaScript is just a total anything goes kind of language. It's actually a really, it is both extremely accessible in some ways when you're first learning coding, but it's kind of not always the best place to start because it kind of lets you do everything, and it fails sometimes in silent, weird ways. So just keep that in mind, that if JavaScript sometimes seems a little frustrating, it might not be you, it might just be JavaScript. And now there are tons of tools, including TypeScript, probably including this. React also has something called prop types, which they deprecated, but was a similar idea where they tried to make you define exactly what kind of props went into your components, so that if it got something it wasn't expecting, it would alert you about it. It's basically all these little frameworks and tools we have now to just kind of warn you when you've made a simple little mistake, or you're doing something that doesn't seem to be what you designed the code to do. So, because you don't really, silent failures are not good. They are extremely hard to debug. It's much better if something can just yell at you right in your code editor before you even run the app. So yeah, I suspect that's what that is, but I'll have to look into that. I'm actually not 100% sure. Cool. Well, if there aren't any other questions, let's take a quick look at this. So this right here will tell you what you can edit in order to mess with this file. We already looked at this, but now we know what we're looking at, so we can hopefully make a quick comparison. So we have this big spinning element right here. We've got some text. We've got a link down here. And that is it. That's the whole thing. It's filling up the entire screen too. So I'm going to take a look at app.js. So we can see the logo is an SVG file. It's being imported from an outside file. It's also importing CSS. So this is a web page, even though this is a React page, it's still HTML and CSS. And CSS works exactly the same as it always does. React doesn't change any of the behavior of CSS. So as far as styling your page, if you've done any kind of web development, or if you want to just look into some resources, any CSS learnings will apply to what we're doing right here. So this is our component. The component is a function. This is kind of a newish thing for React. They didn't used to always look like this. They used to be class-based. So if you ever look at older React stuff, you might see something like this, like class app extends React component, and then you would have like a render function in here, and then that would have this code. You may never even encounter this, and this is now kind of falling by the wayside. There's still some functionality you can get out of that old syntax that you can't with these newer functional components, as they're called, but most of the stuff you're going to see in React is going to look like this now. So that's all that a component actually is. A component is a function that returns JSX, and that's it. So when you're creating your own components, all they need to do is return something. They have to at least return null. They can't return undefined. They have to return a thing, like you have to deliberately return something. As long as they do that, they're a valid function, or a valid component rather. So in this case,
ask quick, sorry to interrupt you.
No, please do.
In your assessment, it would be best to focus mostly on the functional approach rather than the class-based approach, like when going through some of this stuff.
I would say so. You might end up with some older tutorials or stuff that doesn't use that. So I just think that there's not a lot of reason to continue using the class-based syntax at this point. It's more code, and just React seems to be moving away from it in general. So I don't expect it's going to be supported forever, but it's hard to say. Classes are kind of, though, like what this is essentially, this is a class that just has one single method, and that method is render. That's kind of how they work. But they also allow you to use hooks. You can't use hooks in a class component. So there's not exact parity between the two. So yeah, I would recommend sticking with this, but there's no if you are interested, or if you think you might be dipping into older code bases, then it's certainly worthwhile learning the class stuff. It's basically the same. But yeah, I think that this is just kind of seems to be where React is has chosen this path, and is definitely following it right now.
Yeah, we currently teach both because they might encounter code bases with class-based components.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we just teach both of them.
Yeah.
Hey, Quinn, if I might ask, do you happen to know why this, shift has happened? Do you know why React, or the creators of React, kind of moved towards functional base? Is there a reason, or just
I'm not 100% sure. I mean, the whole concept of functional programming has been a little more popular in the last few years versus class-based, but I'm not sure this actually is that. This is where we start getting into somewhat theoretical stuff that is a little out of my purview. I was not a computer science major. I kind of fell into software development a little later in life, so I'm not a good person to ask about some of the theoretical underpinnings. I think they probably, it's less code, and just the class-based thing kind of comes from this object-oriented programming approach that doesn't really suit React. That's just not how React really works. Even though you can fill all your code with classes and do stuff that way if you want. Yeah, I'm not really sure. That's a good question. I'll bet there's maybe some good write-ups out there I should look into. There isn't really anything you can do with this that you couldn't do before. I'll say that. It's not like it's more like just changing the way you write the code, but the code is still basically the same, or at least the functionality is. Okay, so this component is returning all that stuff that we just saw on the screen a second ago. We have, these are, even though this is JSX, these are just straight up HTML tags right here, right? We have a div tag, we have a header, we have an image, we have a paragraph, we have an anchor link. Normal stuff, really. The only thing you might notice in here that's not quite the same as normal is these class names. If you're familiar with HTML, you probably would expect this to just be like, class app or something, right? And then when you open up the app.css file, you would see this, and this looks like a class, right? If you know CSS, little dot before this means this is a CSS class. And this actually ties back into the whole class-based component things. Class is a reserved word in React because you can, call this class app like that. That prevents you from using class within JSX. So their solution to this was just change it to class name. Otherwise, it is functionally identical to using a class in regular HTML, pretty much. So all this can be edited, like they said, so we can, jump into here, change the text right away. When I go back into the browser, it has already changed. So this is one extra cool thing about React. I mentioned before how the diffing algorithm is going to watch for changes, and it's going to update your UI as soon as it changes. In this case, there's also an additional setup that is watching your code, your actual code files locally through a thing called Watchmen. That's watching anytime you save your files, basically. This is just going to auto update, which is really cool. So you don't have to keep refreshing your browser every single time you make a change, even though you probably will compulsively if you're me, because you're just so used to it and you can't get rid of the habit. But you don't have to. This is really great. And these little things, this might just seem like a minor inconvenience, but when you are working on this code for hours every day, like all year round, this does add up to saving you quite a bit of time when you can almost work as fast as you can think, and it's really, really cool. So if you mess around in here, move some stuff around, you should be able to similarly see some changes. You can add your own code wherever you want, and it'll just pop up right there. And this is all just, it's just normal HTML. Like we're not really doing anything too tricky here, but React is making it very, very easy for us to quickly edit this. And similarly, like I said, if you go into the CSS file, this is normal CSS. It's a little bit more complicated than you might have seen because of this like animation stuff. But this is not React. This is just CSS. So it's a whole other set of learnings. And like I said, it all applies to all of the React work you're going to do. So let's say right now the app header is really gigantic, so we can try making it a little smaller if we want. I'm also going to do this because later we're going to start messing around with changing some different components in here. Yeah, and as you can see, just like with the JSX that I edited, when I edited the CSS and I saved the file, it just instantly reloaded the page. So this just makes developers happy, and I think that's a huge part of why things caught on like they did. So I think we're already several slides forward. I mentioned the class name thing. So now I want to get into a little bit of what makes JSX different from just plain HTML. And a big thing is the way that it just lets you kind of put JavaScript into your markup wherever you want in very simple ways. So we're going to take the text that we just wrote and let's replace it with a variable. So let's see how that's going to work. So going back into app.js here, I'll just get rid of this title. We don't need it. I'm going to clean up the code a little here so it's a little clear what's going on. You can, do whatever you want in your code. So now it's just hello code platoon. So let's say I want this to be not just flat text, but I want this to actually be a JavaScript variable. So first off, you'll notice that all this stuff that is coming back from the component is within this return block. But the function can do anything it wants before it gets to here, essentially. So this has to return some kind of markup, but I can do any logic I want above it, and I'm just in pure JavaScript land now. So I'm no longer concerned with any of this, like screwing up any of my markup or anything like that. It's not going to show up on the page as HTML. This is anything outside of the return block. It's just plain JavaScript. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to go ahead and create a variable. I'm going to create a constant, and we'll call it text. And I'll just go ahead and make that there. And then down here, I'm going to remove that the text from here, and I'm going to have some curly braces added. So basically, when you're inside JSX, curly braces just mean anything inside here is JavaScript, execute it as JavaScript, basically. And you can put that anywhere in the code you want. You'll actually notice, if you look closely, the image source is already doing that. It's taking that SVG logo, and it's just putting it in basically as JavaScript and just rendering it out that way. So in this case, I'm just going to put text. And this is just going to take the value. JavaScript, when you just like, take the value of, when you just put a variable, as output, it will just give you the value of the variable. And if we go back into Chrome, then this is updated properly. So we can make it more complicated than this if we want. This can be any JavaScript code at all. So if I want, for example, to make a function of some kind, I can even do that outside of the component if I want. I can make another function. And this can just be print text. And I put in like, some kind of input, right? And I just want to return So I have a function here that basically takes a little bit of input, gives you back a string with that input added. It could do a number of other things we want to that. And if down here, let's say rather than just putting in text in here, I can call that function right here with my text variable, right? And this is just normal JavaScript, and it's just executing right there. And whatever this gives back, it's going to print back out inside my markup. And then we get that. So this is super powerful, and it can lead you to wonderful places, and it can also make your code unreadable and terrible if you're not careful. So all of the fun that we're going to have is going to be kind of within this sort of space. But yeah, basically at any point in your markup, you can just jump right into some JavaScript, and it's super easy. The olden days ways of doing this involved you having to like track down parts of your app that had particular classes or IDs or something, and then manually edit them that way. It was really cumbersome and obnoxious. JSX just streamlines that wonderfully so that looking at your code right here, looking at your markup, you know exactly where all the logic is and where things are going to update and how that's going to happen. Hopefully. Is this making sense to everyone so far? Cool. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this function. This is just proof of concept. So let's go back into here. Really quick, I'm going to make sure I didn't break anything. Okay, so we're back to here. We're just showing the text with a variable. Now I mentioned before that we have a component. We have our app component, right? And currently it's just this one single component, and that's our entire app. But we can split up this component into subcomponents, and then that gives us a lot of flexibility to make the app much bigger and much more complex without getting too hard to manage. So let's try moving the header into its own component. So first off, let's start off by giving, right now we have an actual page down here, but it's just blank. So let's put some actual content into there underneath our header here. Let's make a new paragraph. Put some lorem ipsum in there. Just so we know. Okay, so now we have these sort of two separate parts of our app. And this is how things will often happen when you're developing something real. Like you start out with one component, it gets bigger, a little more complicated, and you start thinking, well, this would be easier if I just split out this one part into a separate component all itself. And again, this is your choice as a developer. You don't need to do this. React has no problem with a 5,000 line component that's incredibly dense and complicated. You're just trying to make your life easier so that you can manage the code that you've created. So let's go ahead. And earlier I made a separate function outside of here. We're going to make specifically a separate component function. And the only thing that makes that any different is the fact that it returns JSX. Like I said, that's all a function has to do to be a React component. So let's go ahead and call this, I'm going to call it my header, just because header is already an HTML tag. So let's try to avoid any confusion. This is all case sensitive, by the way, so you can get into trouble here. If you start naming your own thing header like this, oops. If we name this header and we have another thing that's like, you know, function P or whatever, if you start taking over HTML stuff, React's not going to stop you, and you might get a little bit confused if you're not careful. So it's good to try to use naming conventions that are going to be a little easier to tell what you're actually doing. So let's do this. We're going to grab the header. I'll just take everything that's inside the HTML headers code like so. And I'm going to put it in here. Oops. First, I'm going to return. You also notice that the return here has these parentheses after it. That allows you to do multiple lines of returned markup without it getting confused, essentially. Since JavaScript doesn't require semicolons, it's always trying to figure out where the end of a line is. And if you don't have this little parentheses surrounding your return block, then it might get confused and think that you're stopping right here, essentially. And it will yell at you about that. It will not work. So now you notice already we're having some trouble here. This is not working anymore. That text that I'm using, the variable I created here, didn't come with us into this new component. So I declared this within the scope of the app function. This is kind of an important thing. You might have already covered this in some of the other stuff. I don't know if you talked about scope, function scope, but in most languages, there's the language will try to keep your definitions contained to wherever you defined them, essentially. And JavaScript is just like that. So since I created this inside app, this only exists inside app. And now, in this case, my editor is underlining it. Hopefully yours is too. It kind of depends on what your setup is, and warning me that this doesn't exist. So for now, the easiest fix for that, since we're only using the text in this actual code markup here, is I'm just going to pull that out, and I'm going to put it right at the top of my header here. And my auto formatting is not happy with me, so try to make this look a little prettier. Okay, so if I go back into Chrome, now everything's working, but my header's gone. That's because even though we declared this function here, and we now have moved all of our logic into that for displaying it into that separate component, we're not actually showing the component. The index file is only showing app. App is only showing this. So we have to manually make sure that we put the header component into our markup. And I do that simply by taking its name and then just a closing tag. If I go back in here, boom, it's back. So same exact functionality, really. We haven't changed anything. All we've done is moved around where different things exist. But again, as your app gets complex, you will almost certainly need to do this. You know, probably in a real app, you might have a header that isn't just simply displaying stuff. It might also have like a little login button. It might have some other features that are specific to the user. Maybe there's like a custom menu. You know, there could be any number of things that are going on here that the header and the header alone needs to worry about. So the more complicated something is, the more you really want it to be handling that logic on its own. So your whole page doesn't have to worry about header specific stuff. You essentially pass whatever data you need into the header, and it just kind of handles it on its own. And this is sort of this is in many ways kind of what object-oriented programming, we mentioned classes before, kind of follow that same basic paradigm where you want to split up your logic into these really contained little areas so that they're pretty easy to understand, they're pretty easy to test, and they don't kind of mess with each other in ways that are hard to understand and predict. And so React kind of does that in its own way with the components. But again, this is all how you're setting up your app. You don't have to do any of this if you don't want. React doesn't care. This is how you're going to usually see it done. And it's kind of the conventions that people have gotten used to. But it is ultimately up to you to do all that organization. So you want to kind of start thinking in these terms as early on as possible. It's probably going to make your life a lot easier in the long run. So now, remember when we had that issue with the text not existing in the component? There's another way we could have solved this problem. So let's do this. Let's say for whatever reason, we only had this text defined in our app. You know, maybe this is something that came back from an API call, or the user entered something or whatever, but the header doesn't have it, right? So now you'll notice there's an error there. If you open up Chrome, actually, you will see an error pop up here as well. This is really handy too, because like I said, JavaScript is kind of a go with the flow language. It really tries to just deal with whatever you give it. This was a decision made a long time ago when it started running in web browsers, and they decided, well, the web experience isn't one where people expect to see a lot of error messages. They just want to just kind of try to present things as best as they can. So decisions were made that JavaScript will just sort of do its best, and hopefully you won't notice that something has gone wrong. But this is a really serious problem when you're a developer, and you need to know where things are going wrong. So React itself does have error messages like this, at least when it's running in development mode. And it will tell you flat out, like, hey, on this line right here, this character even, this is not defined. And that is really nice, because otherwise the traditional JavaScript way to deal with this error would be, it would see text and say, well, okay, text is undefined, because anything in JavaScript that you haven't clearly defined has a value of undefined. And then it would just show nothing. And that would be it. So you, the developer, would be looking at your screen being like, well, why isn't my text showing up? And you don't know, is this a problem with the data, or did I screw up the CSS and maybe I made the thing too small and it's just cutting off the view? Like suddenly all these things could be going wrong. And maybe that's if you even notice it isn't there. Maybe there's some times when it's not supposed to be there, right? So even though it's annoying to see these error screens, they're a good thing to be thankful for, because they will just save you so much time. So the other way to do this is to pass in the text as a prop. That's essentially something you can see we're already doing it. You are already used to the syntax in HTML, because it's right here. Like this class name we're passing into the div is a prop. In image, the source we're passing in, the alt text, the class name, those are all props essentially. Those are external bits of data that you pass in from outside that don't change within the component essentially. This is an important thing to remember. Essentially, there's basically two ways that React deals with state. And this is the one that is probably by far the most common, and the one you want to try to use as much as possible, because it's very straightforward. And I'll show you an example. So what we're going to do is we're going to take my header, and the function right now doesn't accept anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an object in here, and it has to be an object. You can't just take in text like this. Or actually, I think you can, but you don't want to do it. It's going to make things very confusing. Essentially, since underneath the hood, like I showed you way back in the beginning of this, this is all getting converted into some JavaScript.